The morning I woke up to 2 feet of snow on my driveway and a bright orange violation notice taped to my front door. I knew it was going to be one of those days. Not one of those mildly annoying days where maybe a pipe drips or the coffee maker acts up. No. This was going to be one of those days that ends with me either laughing hysterically or standing in my kitchen questioning every life decision that led me to buying a house in the Willowbrook Estates HOA community. Spoiler alert, it was both. Let me back up just a little bit, so you understand exactly what we were dealing with out here in Willowbrook Estates that January. We had been watching the weather forecasts for about a week leading up to what the meteorologists were calling a historic winter storm. They were not being dramatic about it either. This thing was massive. The National Weather Service had issued a blizzard warning 3 days in advance, telling everyone in our region to expect somewhere between 22 and 30 inches of snow over a 48-hour period, with wind gusts up to 50 miles per hour and temperatures dropping to single digits overnight. Single digits, Fahrenheit, with wind chill making it feel like -15 or -20. This was not a little December dusting. This was a full-on, close the highways, declare a state of emergency, do not leave your house kind of storm, and we all knew it was coming. Now I am Matt Lambert. I have lived at 14 Crestwood Drive in Willowbrook Estates for about 6 years. Nice neighborhood, good neighbors, tree-lined streets, decent park at the end of the block, friendly faces when you take the dog out in the morning. The HOA dues are a little steep at $380 a month, but the common areas are well maintained and the neighborhood looks nice, so for a while I figured it was worth it. For a while. The HOA board of Willowbrook Estates had 7 members, but for all practical purposes, it was run by one woman. Deborah Covington. Deborah lived on the corner lot at 2 Willowbrook Circle, the biggest house on the block, with manicured hedges that she had the landscaping company touch up literally every 2 weeks, even in autumn when it seemed pointless. She drove a pearl white SUV that she parked at an angle in her driveway, so it was slightly more visible from the street. She was on every committee, chaired every meeting, and sent out more violation notices per month than any 10 other HOA boards I had ever heard of. My neighbor Craig called her the HOA Pharaoh because what she decreed was law, and anyone who challenged her wished they had not. Deborah had been on a big environmentalism kick over the past year. Now I want to be clear. I'm not against environmentalism. I recycle. I drive a hybrid. I replaced my old lawn mower with a battery-powered one 2 summers ago without anyone telling me to. But Deborah's version of environmentalism was less about genuine care for the planet and more about control. Every new rule she pushed through the board was framed as going green, but the end result was always the same. More restrictions, more fines, more power for Deborah Covington. In October, she had pushed through a new rule banning gas-powered lawn equipment. At first, that had just meant lawn mowers and leaf blowers. People grumbled, but the season was almost over anyway, so most folks just went along with it. But then in November, at the monthly HOA meeting that about 12 people attended out of a neighborhood of 240 homes, Deborah pushed through an amendment to that rule that extended it to all gas-powered yard and driveway maintenance equipment, including, specifically, gas snowblowers. The amendment stated that effective December 1st, the only snow removal equipment permitted for individual homeowner use on driveways and walkways in Willowbrook Estates was electric or battery-powered equipment. Gas snowblowers were, and I am quoting from the actual rule text here, strictly prohibited and subject to immediate fine and possible equipment confiscation upon first offense. The fine was $150 per day of violation. I remember reading that at the time and thinking it was a little aggressive, but I also remember thinking that most people in the neighborhood already had decent gas blowers, and a rule like this would be almost impossible to enforce in the middle of a snowstorm. So I did not worry too much about it. Big mistake. My gas snowblower was a 291cc two-stage unit that I had bought 3 winters ago after that nightmare February storm where I spent 4 hours shoveling by hand and threw out my back. That thing could eat through a foot of heavy wet snow like it was nothing. I had serviced it in November, filled the oil, checked the belts, made sure everything was ready to go. It was sitting in my garage, fueled up and ready, and I felt great knowing it was there. 3 days before the storm hit, I got a letter in the mail from the HOA. It was a reminder notice. It had Deborah's name and signature at the bottom. The letter reminded all homeowners of the new gas equipment prohibition, listed the fines, and specifically mentioned that with the approaching storm, inspectors would be actively monitoring the neighborhood during and after the snow event to ensure compliance. Inspectors, during a blizzard. She was going to send people out during a blizzard to make sure nobody used a gas snowblower. I read it twice. I put it down. I picked it up and read it one more time. Then I set it on my kitchen counter and stared at it while I drank my coffee. My neighbor Greg Whitfield from across the street came over that afternoon. Greg is a retired electrician, mid-60s, solid guy, the kind of neighbor who shows up with a generator if your power goes out without you even having to ask. Greg had the same letter and he was not happy. He had a big Honda gas snowblower that he used to clear not only his own driveway but the driveways of the 2 elderly couples on either side of him. He had been doing that for years, voluntarily, just because that is the kind of guy Greg is. The idea of not being able to do that in the middle of a historic blizzard was infuriating him. I also texted my buddy Dave Kowalski from down the street, and Dave's response was very on brand. He said, and I'm not cleaning this up much, that Deborah Covington could take her amendment and put it somewhere anatomically challenging. Dave had a way with words. 2 days before the storm, I went to the hardware store on the west side of town. The parking lot was packed. I mean genuinely slammed. Half the county was there stocking up. I needed a few things for the house, some rock salt, extra ice melt, a new set of windshield scrapers. While I was there, I walked down the snowblower aisle just out of curiosity, wondering if there was maybe a decent battery-powered unit I could grab as a backup, just to stay technically compliant. What I found was a wall of empty pegs and display tags with no product behind them. Every single electric snowblower they normally stocked was gone. The one employee in that section, a teenager named Bryce according to his name tag, told me they had sold out of battery-powered snowblowers in about 4 hours the day before once people started reading the HOA letter. He also told me they had called around to every other hardware store within 40 miles, and they were all out too. Online shipping options were showing 3 to 7 business day delivery estimates, which was nowhere close to fast enough. So let me paint you this picture clearly. We had a record blizzard coming in 48 hours. The HOA had banned the only equipment that could realistically handle it. The replacement equipment was completely sold out, and Deborah Covington was apparently going to send inspectors out into the storm to fine people $150 a day for using their own snowblowers on their own driveways. I drove home from that hardware store with a feeling I can only describe as the calm that comes before you decide you are done playing nice. That night I pulled up the Willowbrook Estates HOA governing documents, all of them, the CC and RS, the bylaws, the rules and regulations, all of it. I had downloaded them when I first bought the house and never really read most of it. I poured myself a mug of hot coffee, sat down at my kitchen table, and started going through everything with a yellow highlighter. I was there until about 1 in the morning, and here is what I found. Section 12, Paragraph 4 of the CC and RS stated clearly that any amendment to the community rules and regulations that imposed new restrictions on individual homeowner property use required a minimum 30-day written notice period to all homeowners before taking effect, and that any rule deemed to create an unreasonable hardship for homeowners could be challenged in writing within that 30-day window by a petition signed by at least 15% of homeowners. The electric-only equipment rule had been pushed through at a meeting in November and had gone into effect December 1st. The written notice had been mailed, according to the letter's own timestamp, only 18 days before the effective date. Not 30, 18. I also found Section 8, Paragraph 9, which stated that no HOA rule could unreasonably prevent homeowners from maintaining their property in a manner necessary for health and safety. Snow removal in conditions that impede emergency vehicle access or create fall hazards was explicitly listed as an example of a health and safety maintenance concern. I wrote all of this down in a separate document with page and section references. Then I went to bed feeling considerably better than I had 12 hours earlier. The storm hit on a Thursday. It started overnight Wednesday, just a light dusting at first, but by Thursday morning when I got up at 6, the snow was coming down hard and the wind was already howling. By 10 a.m., we had about 8 inches on the ground and it was accelerating. The city's plows had been out on the main roads, but our neighborhood streets were untouched. People were starting to peek out their windows, watching the accumulation stack up, everyone clearly thinking the same thing, which was, at what point do we just go ahead and use the gas blowers? My phone was already lighting up with texts from the neighborhood group chat. People were frustrated. One woman, Lindsay from the cul-de-sac, posted a photo of her elderly mother who was visiting and said that her mom's doctor's appointment was tomorrow and she needed to be able to get her car out of the garage. Dave sent his usual colorful commentary. Greg Whitfield texted me directly and said his neighbors Frank and Alina Baxter, who were in their late 70s, were already calling him asking if he could clear their driveway. Frank had a heart condition and was absolutely not supposed to be shoveling, and Alina couldn't physically do it herself. Greg was asking me what we should do. Around 11 that morning, my doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Deborah Covington standing on my porch, bundled in a puffy North Face coat, holding a clipboard, with a younger man standing behind her who I recognized as Kyle, her son-in-law who she had somehow installed as an HOA compliance officer the previous spring. Kyle always looked vaguely apologetic about whatever Deborah was doing, like a dog that knew its owner was about to do something embarrassing but had no power to stop it. Deborah gave me her signature tight smile, the one that did not reach her eyes. She was standing in a good 4 inches of actively falling snow and holding a clipboard like we were in the middle of a warm, sunny neighborhood inspection, and not the opening act of what was being described on the radio as the most significant winter storm in the region in 30 years. She told me she was doing a preemptive compliance check and wanted to make sure I was aware that the gas equipment ban was fully in effect and that any violation would result in an immediate fine. She said she had already noticed my neighbor Greg's garage door had been up that morning, and she could see his gas snowblower inside, and that she was putting everyone on notice. I stood in my doorway in my flannel shirt and wool socks, and I looked at this woman holding a clipboard in the middle of a blizzard, and I made a decision right then. I was going to be perfectly polite, perfectly pleasant, and I was going to document every single thing that happened going forward. I told Deborah that I appreciated her stopping by and that I was familiar with the rule. I also mentioned, casually, that I had been reviewing the governing documents and had some questions about the rule's implementation that I planned to bring up formally. She asked what kind of questions. I told her I had concerns about the notice period and the health and safety provisions. She gave me a look like I had just told her I had concerns about the direction of the sun. She said the rule was duly passed and fully enforceable. I smiled. I said I looked forward to discussing it. She left. I went inside, got my phone, and started filming the outside from my front window, not because anything was happening yet, but because I wanted to establish a record of conditions. The snow depth, the visibility. The fact that the road in front of my house was already heavily snow-covered and showing no sign of city plowing anytime soon. By 2 in the afternoon, We had about 16 inches on the ground and the storm was still going strong. The neighborhood group chat had turned into a full-on strategy session. I posted the relevant sections of the CC and RS I had found the night before, specifically the 30-day notice requirement and the health and safety provision. I typed it out clearly with the section numbers. I watched the red receipts climb. Then I watched the responses start coming in. People were fired up, not in an angry mob way, but in a finally we have something concrete way. My neighbor Patricia, who it turned out had been a paralegal for 15 years before retiring, messaged me privately and said that the notice period violation was absolutely real, and she had seen similar HOA rule challenges succeed on exactly that basis. She said it was enough to formally contest the rule and potentially have it suspended pending review. I drafted a formal written challenge to the gas equipment rule using the CC and RS language. I cited Section 12, Paragraph 4, and the insufficient notice period. I cited Section 8, Paragraph 9, and the health and safety maintenance necessity. I mentioned specifically that all battery and electric snowblowers in the local area had sold out following the HOA's notification letter, creating a situation where homeowners had been given inadequate notice, given inadequate time to obtain compliant equipment, and now faced a genuine health and safety emergency with a historic blizzard in progress. I requested an immediate emergency suspension of enforcement pending a full homeowner vote. I sent it to the HOA's official email address. I CC'd every board member whose email I could find in the documents. I also printed a physical copy and put it in an envelope addressed to the HOA's registered address. And then I got in my car, drove to the end of my street, dropped it in the mailbox at the corner, and filmed myself doing it so there was a timestamp. Meanwhile, at about 3 in the afternoon, things were getting real out in the neighborhood. I could see from my front window that Eleanor and Frank Baxter's driveway was completely buried. The snow was still falling hard. Dave Kowalski had tried to use his battery-powered leaf blower on his driveway, which honestly was kind of heroic in its commitment to compliance, and also completely useless because this was a 2-stage snowblower situation, not a leaf blower situation. Dave gave up after about 20 minutes and came in. Then something happened that I think really crystallized the situation for everyone. Lindsay from the cul-de-sac called 911 because her elderly mother had slipped on the front step trying to get to the mailbox, which she never should have been doing. But the front walk had not been cleared because Lindsay was afraid of getting fined. Her mom was okay, just shaken, no serious injury. But when the paramedics tried to get down Willowbrook Circle in their ambulance, they had trouble because the street was so snow-covered, and narrow and several driveways had spilled snow onto the road because homeowners had been trying to manually shovel and just pushing snow everywhere without the ability to properly clear it. The paramedics managed, but just barely. The news about the ambulance call spread through the group chat in about 4 minutes flat. At around 4 in the afternoon, while I was monitoring the group chat and watching the weather, my doorbell rang again. It was Greg Whitfield. He was standing there with his coat on, hat pulled down, and he had an expression on his face that I can only describe as a man who had made peace with his choices. He told me he was going to go clear Frank and Eleanor's driveway. He said he was using his gas snowblower. He said he knew what that meant and he did not care. He showed me his phone. He had read my message in the group chat about the CC and RS. He said he thought I made a good case, but he was not willing to wait for it to be resolved through proper channels, while 2 elderly people in their late 70s sat in a house with a buried driveway and no way out in a medical emergency. I respected the heck out of Greg Whitfield. I also went back inside and grabbed my own gas snowblower out of my garage. I rolled it to the end of my driveway, started it up, cleared my own driveway and front walk in about 12 minutes, and then went across the street and helped Greg with the Baxters. Eleanor was watching from the front window and waved at us. She came to the door when we were done and tried to give Greg $20. He would not take it. She gave him a tin of Christmas cookies she still had in the house from the holidays. He took those. I went back inside, uploaded the driveway clearing video to my phone's cloud backup, time-stamped everything, and made note of the approximately 21 inches of snow depth I had measured before clearing. I had a feeling documentation was going to matter. It did not take long. About 40 minutes after Greg and I cleared the Baxter's driveway, a car came slowly rolling down the street. It was Deborah's pearl white SUV. I watched it from my window. It stopped in front of the Baxter's house. Deborah and Kyle got out. Deborah walked up to the edge of the cleared driveway, looked at it, wrote something on her clipboard, and then stood there in the blowing snow pointing at Greg's house across the street, while Kyle took photos on his phone. The violation notices arrived the next morning, one for Greg and one for me, each for $150, both with a note that said repeated violation would result in accelerated fines and potential towing of the equipment from the property. Towing of the equipment from the property. She was going to try to take our snowblowers. Now, I want to be accurate about what happened next because I have told this story a few times and I want to make sure I get the details right. That evening, still during the blizzard, which had now deposited about 25 inches of snow and was still going, I got a call from my neighbor Patricia. She told me she had been doing some research beyond the CC and RS issue. She had looked into whether the confiscation threat was legal under state property law. The answer was pretty clearly no. An HOA cannot legally seize or remove personal property from a privately owned garage under any standard HOA enforcement provision. They can fine you. They can take you to small claims court. They can try to put a lien on your home in extreme cases of non-payment, but they cannot roll up to your house and take your snowblower. That would be, legally speaking, theft. Patricia told me to document the confiscation threat. She told me if anyone from the HOA so much as touched equipment on private property, we should call the police immediately. I thanked her and then went and forwarded the violation notices and the confiscation threat language to my small personal email archive that was growing considerably at this point. The storm finally wound down late Friday evening. Final accumulation in our area was 28 inches, which broke the previous record for a single storm event by about 4 inches. The roads were a mess. The city was working overtime to plow and treat everything. Our neighborhood streets were, naturally, buried. By Saturday morning, it was clear that Deborah was not backing down. She sent a mass email to all homeowners restating the gas equipment ban, acknowledging that she was aware multiple homeowners had violated it during the storm, and warning that all violations were documented and fines were being assessed. She also included a pointed paragraph stating that those who had submitted so-called challenges to the rule would find that the board had reviewed those submissions and determined the rule was duly enacted and fully valid. She said the challenges were without merit. She had not addressed the notice period issue at all. Not a word about the 18 versus 30 days. She just said the challenges were without merit and moved on. That told me something important. It told me she either had not actually checked the governing documents or she was hoping nobody else had. That Saturday morning I sat down and I made some calls. The first was to a local attorney named Stephen Marsh, who specialized in community association law and had a website that came up when I searched for HOA dispute attorneys in our area. I got his answering service and left a message explaining the situation in brief. He called me back that afternoon. Stephen was very helpful. He confirmed everything Patricia had told me about the notice period being a real and substantial procedural defect. He also confirmed that the confiscation threat was likely an empty one legally, but still potentially actionable as a harassment or intimidation measure, depending on context. He said that if the HOA actually attempted to physically take property from anyone's home or garage, that would be theft or conversion, and they should call the police immediately. He also said something interesting. He told me that HOA boards sometimes push through rules at poorly attended meetings specifically because they knew most homeowners would not show up to contest them, and that the courts generally took a dim view of that tactic when it was combined with a clear procedural violation like the notice period issue. I asked him what it would cost to send a formal cease and desist letter from his office. He gave me a number. I called the group chat, and within about 6 hours I had commitments from 22 homeowners to chip in and cover the cost of a formal legal letter. 22 people, all within about 6 hours of me posting the question. That is how angry people were. Stephen sent the letter Monday morning. It was addressed to the HOA Board of Willowbrook Estates. It cited the CC and RS sections specifically. It formally challenged the validity of the gas equipment rule due to the procedural defect in its enactment. It demanded immediate suspension of enforcement of the rule pending a properly noticed homeowner vote in accordance with the governing documents. It noted that equipment confiscation from private property would constitute theft and would result in criminal complaints being filed immediately. And it reserved the right to seek legal remedies for fines already issued under the invalid rule. The board received that letter Monday afternoon. I know because 3 of the 7 board members texted me personally before the end of the business day. 2 of them were basically saying they had no idea any of this was a problem, and they were very uncomfortable. One of them, a retired engineer named Tom Haskins, said outright that he had raised questions about the notice period when the amendment was being discussed in November, and Deborah had assured him the process was fine. He said he wanted to talk. Tom Haskins and I had coffee Tuesday morning at the diner on Route 9. He was a straightforward man in his late 60s, sensible, clearly not someone who had intended to be part of anything that crossed legal lines. He told me that Deborah had been increasingly running the board in a way that made other members feel like rubber stamps. He told me she set the agenda, she drafted the rules, she presented them as already decided, and she made anyone who questioned her feel like they were being obstructionist. He said 2 other board members felt the same way and had been looking for an opportunity to push back but had not found solid ground until now. I told Tom about the ambulance situation with Lindsay's mother. I told him about Frank and Alina Baxter, who were in their late 70s with Frank's heart condition, who could not have cleared their own driveway, and whose neighbors had been willing to face fines to help them. Tom was quiet for a moment, and then he said something I thought was well put. He said that a community association existed to serve the community, and when it started working against the people it was supposed to serve, it had fundamentally lost its way. He asked me what I wanted out of this. I told him honestly, I wanted the fines rescinded. I wanted the gas equipment ban repealed or at minimum suspended and put to a proper homeowner vote with proper notice. I wanted the threat of equipment confiscation walked back formally, and I wanted assurances that the board would operate transparently going forward in accordance with the governing documents. I was not trying to burn the HOA down. I just wanted it to work the way it was supposed to. Tom said he thought all of that was achievable, and that he would work on it from the inside. He also mentioned, carefully, that there was one more thing I should probably know about. He said Deborah had been the one who selected and contracted with the HOA's Compliance Inspector Service, the company that employed people like Kyle, and that she had directed the contract to a company that was owned by her brother-in-law. He said the contract had been signed without a competitive bid process, and without board approval on the specific vendor choice. I looked at him across the diner table. I said that sounded like a conflict of interest at minimum and potentially a breach of fiduciary duty. He said that was his concern as well. He said he had been hesitant to raise it because he did not want to seem like he was attacking Deborah personally. I told him attacking corruption was not the same as attacking a person personally, and that if it was a genuine misuse of HOA funds that came from homeowners' dues, it absolutely needed to be investigated. I spent that evening going through the HOA's financial disclosures that they were required to provide to homeowners under state law. The HOA management company sent annual financial summaries, and they were technically public to residents. I had never looked at them before, but I looked now. The compliance inspection contract line item showed payments to a company called CE Services, LLC. The payments were $3,200 a month. I looked up CE Services, LLC in the state business registry. It had been registered 2 years ago. The registered agent was a man named Paul Renner. I did a quick search on that name and Paul Renner, and found a LinkedIn profile for a Paul Renner who worked in facilities management and whose profile listed a family connection that matched exactly what Tom had described. Deborah's brother-in-law. I sent all of this to Stephen Marsh. He called me the next morning and said that what I had found appeared to be a serious breach of the board's fiduciary duty to homeowners and potentially a misappropriation of funds. He said the way it needed to be handled was with a formal complaint to the state's Community Association regulatory oversight body, which in our state had the authority to audit HOA finances and refer matters for prosecution if warranted. He helped me draft that complaint. Tom Haskins co-signed it along with 2 other board members. We filed it that Wednesday, 4 days after the storm had ended. In the meantime, the neighborhood was not exactly quiet. Deborah had sent out a second enforcement notice to 6 additional homeowners who she had identified from her blizzard time inspections as having used gas equipment. Some of those people got fines of $150. One couple she had assessed a $300 fine to, claiming they had violated on 2 separate days. People were furious. The group chat was, let us say, active. Then something happened that I did not engineer, but that ended up being very helpful. Dave Kowalski, who despite his colorful language was actually a pretty organized and methodical thinker when he wanted to be, had a Ring camera on his garage. His camera had captured footage of Deborah and Kyle driving slowly through the neighborhood on Friday afternoon during the height of the blizzard, at a time when visibility was poor and the wind was blowing hard. Dave's footage showed Deborah's SUV stopping in front of multiple houses, Deborah getting out with a clipboard, walking up driveways, and in one instance appearing to look in through a garage window on the side of a neighbor's house. A man named Pete Garza who lived 2 doors down from Dave. When Pete saw the footage, he was disturbed. He said he had not answered the door that day because he assumed it was the wind or something settling, not someone actually walking up to his house and looking through his window during a blizzard. He said that felt deeply uncomfortable. Pete also had a side yard camera that had captured Deborah walking along the side of his house toward the window. He sent me the footage. I sent it to Stephen Marsh. Stephen said he did not want to characterize it legally until he had reviewed it fully, but he said it was worth noting and preserving, and that if a pattern of behavior could be demonstrated, it might be relevant to harassment claims. The regulatory complaint filed that Wednesday moved faster than I expected, honestly. The state's Community Association Oversight Office had apparently received a number of complaints about Willowbrook Estates over the years, and ours was specific enough and well documented enough that they escalated it to their enforcement team within a week. An investigator made contact with Tom Haskins and the other board members who had co-signed within 10 days of our filing. Meanwhile, our attorney's letter had done its job. The HOA board held an emergency session the following Saturday. Deborah was furious, from what Tom told me afterward, but she was outnumbered. 4 of the 7 board members voted to immediately suspend enforcement of the gas equipment ban and rescind all fines issued under it. The vote was 4-2 with 1 abstention. Deborah voted against. The other no vote was a woman named Carol who Deborah had brought onto the board herself and who basically always voted with her. The abstention was a man who Tom described as terrified of conflict. Every homeowner who had been fined under the gas equipment rule received a written notice rescinding their fine within 3 days of that vote, including Greg and me. I put mine in a frame. Not really, but I thought about it. The gas equipment ban was put to a proper homeowner vote with full 30-day written notice as required by the governing documents. The vote was conducted 6 weeks later. The result was 176 votes against the rule and 22 in favor. I do not know who the 22 were, but I suspect at least a few of them were people who genuinely cared about the environmental angle and just wanted it handled properly, which is fair. The rule was dead. The investigation into the CE Services LLC contract took a bit longer, but it had consequences. The State Oversight Office determined that the contract had been awarded in violation of the HOA's own procurement policy, which required competitive bids for any contract over $1,500 per month. 3 years of payments to CE Services LLC at $3,200 a month came to a total of just under $116,000. The investigation also found that Deborah had not disclosed her family connection to the vendor at any point, which was a direct violation of the HOA's conflict of interest policy. The Oversight Office referred the matter to the county prosecutor's office. This is where things escalated in a way I genuinely had not entirely anticipated when I started going through those CC and RS at my kitchen table during a blizzard. The prosecutor's office opened a criminal investigation. It took several months to work through, as these things do, but ultimately Deborah Covington was charged with breach of fiduciary duty and misappropriation of funds in connection with the no-bid contract. The charges were serious enough that she retained a criminal defense attorney. She resigned from the HOA board within 48 hours of the charges being filed. She sent a 3-sentence email to the board announcing her resignation and thanking the community for the years she had served. No apology, no acknowledgement of what had happened, just 3 sentences and then silence. Her pearl-white SUV was in the driveway of 2 Willowbrook Circle for a few weeks, and then it was gone. And a few months later there was a for sale sign in the front yard of the corner lot. Deborah Covington sold her house and moved out of Willowbrook Estates that spring. The criminal case ultimately resolved with a plea agreement. Deborah pleaded guilty to a reduced charge and was ordered to make restitution to the HOA of approximately $58,000, which represented roughly half the estimated overpayment on the CE Services contract, compared to what competitive bids would likely have obtained. She received 2 years of probation and was permanently barred from serving on any community association board in the state. Kyle, her son-in-law and the compliance officer, had not been found to have had knowledge of the financial misconduct and was not charged with anything. He actually sent me an email after everything was resolved. He said he was sorry for showing up at people's doors during a blizzard and that he had known it felt wrong but had not known how to push back against Deborah. I believed him and I appreciated the message. The HOA reorganized its board. Tom Haskins became the interim president and oversaw the election of 4 new board members over the following year. They rewrote the enforcement policy to require documented evidence and homeowner notification before any fine could be issued. They created a homeowner advocacy position on the board, essentially a person whose specific job was to represent homeowner interests when new rules were being considered. They hired a new compliance management company through a competitive bid process. Monthly dues did not go up. The neighborhood kept looking nice. Greg Whitfield went on clearing Frank and Alina Baxter's driveway every winter after that, gas snowblower and all, because there was no rule against it anymore. Frank and Alina still gave him Christmas cookies every year. Alina added a tin of homemade fudge to the package the first winter after everything resolved, as a sort of celebratory bonus, which Greg reported was exceptional. I ran into Dave Kowalski the following December, right before the first snowfall of the new winter. He was standing in his driveway looking at the sky with a look of deeply satisfied contentment. I asked him what he was thinking about. He said he was thinking about how good it was going to feel to fire up his snowblower with no orange notice on his door in the morning. I told him that was a good thought. He said it was the best thought he had had in months. I thought about that a lot during that first easy, legally uncomplicated winter. About how much energy had gone into what should have been a completely non-issue. How a historic blizzard had somehow turned into the catalyst for exposing years of procedural violations and financial misconduct. Because one woman had decided that she had the right to tell 240 households what equipment they were allowed to use to clear snow off their own driveways. About how close it had come to something genuinely dangerous, with the ambulance on Willowbrook Circle and Frank Baxter's heart condition and Alina watching from the window while we cleared her driveway in the blowing snow. It made me think about how these things go, how communities work, how the HOA structure at its core is actually a reasonable thing. People sharing a neighborhood, pooling some resources, agreeing to some common standards so everyone's property holds its value and the place looks decent, and nobody parks a boat on blocks in the front yard forever. That is actually a good idea. The problem is not the HOA concept. The problem is what happens when unchecked authority meets a person who has confused the power of their small office with the authority of something much larger. Someone who has decided that the rules exist to serve them, rather than the community they were supposed to represent. Someone who looks at a blizzard warning, looks at two elderly neighbors, looks at an ambulance trying to navigate a snow-covered street, and thinks about clipboard entries and violation fees. The reason we won was not complicated. It was just that we actually read the documents. We knew our rights. We documented everything. We stayed polite and on the record. We found the people inside the system who still had integrity, and we gave them the solid ground they needed to stand on. And we called in the appropriate authorities at the right time and let the legal and regulatory processes do their job. None of that required anything dramatic. It just required paying attention and being willing to do the work. That and the fact that trying to ban gas snowblowers during a record blizzard without bothering to follow your own 30-day notice rule was, diplomatically speaking, not the most strategically sound governance decision Deborah Covington ever made. The irony is that I genuinely might have just bought a battery-powered snowblower and grumbled about it if she had done this properly. Given us 30 days notice in late October, let people plan ahead and buy the equipment, phased it in reasonably. I might have just done it. I replaced my lawn mower without a fight. A properly handled transition to electric snow removal. Honestly, I probably would have been fine with it. But that was never really what it was about. The rule was about control. The compliance inspections during a blizzard were about control. The threat to confiscate equipment from private garages was about control. And the whole thing ran on the assumption that nobody would bother to push back, that people would just pay the fine and go back inside, that the clipboard and the violation notice were more powerful than the governing documents that the clipboard and the violation notice were supposed to be enforcing. They were not. The last thing I want to mention, because I think it matters, is what happened with Frank and Alina Baxter. The following spring, Frank had a pretty serious cardiac event. He recovered, but it was touch and go for a few days, and it underscored the reality that the Baxters were at a point in their lives where a buried driveway in an emergency was not a minor inconvenience but a genuine safety issue. When I went to visit Frank in the hospital, he grabbed my arm and said thank you for what you did last winter. I told him honestly that Greg Whitfield was the one who should get the credit for that. Frank said that was fair, and then he said, "But you gave Greg the information he needed to know it was worth doing." I thought about that for a while. Frank made a full recovery and was back home by March. Alina baked a cake to celebrate, a real one from scratch, and she had it delivered to Greg's door. Greg told me about it the next morning, looking genuinely touched in a way that a man who has lived through 60-something winters and retired after 40 years of electrical work only rarely looks. He said it was a really good cake. I believe him. The neighborhood after all of it was different. Not dramatically different, but there was a kind of ease to it that had not been there before. People waved more. The group chat calmed down because it did not need to be a war room anymore. The new HOA board meetings actually had real attendance because people trusted that what happened there mattered and would be handled honestly. Tom Haskins ran those meetings like a person who respected the people in the room, which turned out to be a quality that was not as common as it should be. My house on 14 Crestwood Drive is still my house. My gas snowblower is still in my garage, serviced every November, ready to go. The first big snowfall of each winter, I start it up and clear my driveway and my front walk, and then I go help whoever needs it. No clipboard, no orange notices. Just neighbors taking care of each other during a storm, which is actually what community was supposed to look like in the first place. If Deborah Covington ever looks back on how things played out, I hope she understands that it did not have to go the way it went. The record blizzard was going to happen no matter what. The need to clear 28 inches of snow from driveways in a neighborhood full of families and elderly people was always going to be real and pressing and non-negotiable. She had the chance to respond to that with some basic human flexibility and say, maybe this is not the week to strictly enforce this particular rule. She had the chance to read her own governing documents before pushing through an amendment. She had the chance to award that compliance contract without routing it to her brother-in-law's company. She made different choices. Those choices caught up with her, as choices have a way of doing when you make them in a community of people who are paying attention. The blizzard was what finally made everyone pay attention. And honestly, as miserable as those 48 hours of historic snowfall were, as frustrated as I was standing at my kitchen counter reading that violation notice with 2 feet of snow on my driveway, I am a little grateful for it. Because it turned out that Willowbrook Estates was a genuinely good neighborhood full of genuinely decent people who just needed to know they could stand together and fight for it. And as it turned out, a $150 fine and a threatened snowblower confiscation was exactly the right kind of ridiculous to make that happen.